Now there are many medical millionaires and probably billionaires in this country now who have done not dissimilar things. They've used medical training and they've gone into the market and they've found a product that works and they've applied business skills. So are they doctors or are they business people? They're both. And that's very much what Barnes was.
Well, what about his taste for art? I mean, where did that come from? He made this fortune. He was a doctor. He made this fortune. And then he went to Europe. And what drew him, particularly to modern art and to the kinds of things that he went about collecting?
Right. I think there were several things feeding in. One was when he was at Central High, he was friendly with William Glackens, who was, you know, as you said in the introduction, I was president of the Pennsylvania Academy. Glackens was one of the Academy alums and one of the famous 8, 5 of whom came from the Academy, the great movement who formed in New York in 1908. And so was John Sloan, another, and they were all at school together. And Glackens became friendly with Barnes. Barnes, at some point, was drawing and painting, but clearly decided, and probably sensibly, that this wasn't going to be his life's work. And he didn't stay in contact with Glackens all the time, but there was a point where he was becoming interested in art again, where he drew Glackens back into him. But I think clearly from reading across the various biographies, and anything I say is, there's absolutely nothing in my research as I'm drawing on other people's research. Clearly an important influence was John G. Johnson, who was the great American lawyer. I mean, the doyen of Philadelphia lawyers, arguably the great lawyer in America of his time, who formed the Johnson Collection, which is now part of the PMA. And he was Barnes's lawyer. And Johnson had all his paintings, his old masters, and some more modern things in his house in Philadelphia, all shown up to the ceiling and all crammed together. And, people talk, let's just divert for a moment onto that taste. People say, well, that's a very special way that Barnes shows the paintings, all densely shown. Well, again, that was, if you think back to the early years of the century, probably up to the 30s, even the 40s, that was the common way of displaying art. The salon, we call it salon hanging because it was the way the salons in France were hung. And if you look at the annuals from the Pennsylvania Academy, the photographs, everything, you can't see the wall because the frames are just pushed together like that. And that's how Johnson had his collection. That's clearly how you hung collections. And we can talk about what was unique about the Barnes way of doing it later. But he saw Johnson's collection. I think and because he clearly was very impressed by Johnson as a man and by as a lawyer, and he saw there was some interest in collecting art, and he acknowledges Johnson as a very important influence. He also talks about the Habermas, the great collectors, as a very important influence too. So Johnson, Habermas, Glackens, he's seeing that
in that circle.
He's in that circle, and he's seeing that it's an interesting thing to do. And he talks later on, I could have been a playboy for my life away, I could have done this. I decided to use my money to collect art. A very rational thing, and a lot of people do it. Again, he wasn't unique in that. He did it extremely well.
Now that's it. He did it extremely well. How do you explain that? And what does it mean to do it extremely well? His taste was impeccable. He chose painters who turned out to be enduring. Certainly Matisse. He has so much of Matisse. Could you elaborate a little bit on what you feel his talent as a collector consisted of?
I think you can't make those judgments until much later. Because we can look at collectors today, and sometimes you can't say, well, they're doing it extremely well, because you don't know, you're not quite sure what the judgment of history is going to be.
You don't have hindsight.
You don't have the hindsight. We've got the advantage of 80 years actually even 90 years on the Barnes collection, and so we can see that the painters that he acquired in depth, in the case of Renoir or Masse, are now regarded as the great modern painters. Renoir and Cézannes were already very famous when he started collecting, and he talks about when he first sends Glackens to Paris with a commission to buy paintings in 1912. He talks about, Glackens talks about being able to get this little one and that little one. The prices for those painters were already very high, so it wasn't as if he was discovering Cézanne or Renoir. Matisse was much more of a discovery. Matisse was not was not well known when Barnes started collecting them. But it was a combination of judiciousness and luck And people, actually Bob Sainsbury used to say, you know, people asked me whether I was lucky, and he used to say, no, I wasn't lucky. I had the opportunity, but I took the opportunity. And I think that's, you know, one wants to be careful of saying Barnes was lucky to be in the right place at the right time. He wasn't a good place at a good time, and he had a lot of money, and he took the opportunity.
Right, it's that combination of factors.
I'm not sure you'd really call it luck, but he came into contact with some very key people, with de la Vollard, most importantly with Steins, Gertrude and her brother Leo Stein, and not long afterwards he came into contact with Paul Guillaume, who was, you know, all of them were major dealers, and the case, well, not dealers, the Steins weren't. The Steins were major collectors, and Guillaume was became the most important dealer for the School of Paris. So, you know, Barnes's discovery of soutine, which was, you know, very acute, but he saw soutine in Guillaume's gallery. He was astute to realize that soutine, who's a very wild, still very difficult painter for many people, was somebody he really liked. But it wasn't as if he went to the soutine studio and discovered. He saw it in Guillaume. Likewise, the African art. It pretty well all came from Guillaume, and that's why I love this sort of loop that seems to have been closed. Not that any loop's really closed, with my time at the Sainsbury Centre and the Barnes, because the first pieces in the Sainsbury Collection, non-Western pieces, were two African heads, or a mask and a head, which had come from Paul Guillaume. So
that's an interesting link.
Yeah, I mean, I felt
that's interesting. That I guess they both had a certain.
He was very, but it was also because Guillaume was just there. It's hard not to, if you're interested in that, you couldn't avoid him. You couldn't go around him.
But the point was to recognize it.
Yeah.
I want to get to now and the whole business of the Barnes move, because that has been a source of a great deal of controversy, not only in Philadelphia but throughout the country and the world. And I wonder if you would talk a bit to the topic. On the one hand, people are saying that moving the Barnes collection as is intended now goes against the spirit of his will. Others say it's in the spirit, the democratic spirit of his thinking. Could you talk a bit about the rationale for the move and why you think it's necessary?
Yeah, sure. And I think the people who oppose actually do it with with great passion and great sincerity, and I may disagree with them, but often with the reading of Barnes, which is a legitimate reading, but there are other readings of Barnes. I think that's one of the things about Barnes that we may talk about, is the contradictions and the complexities of Barnes.
Well, you've said to me before that there are different Barnes at different points.
I think there are.
That he seems to have undergone various changes, and sometimes he will actually contradict himself in his writing from what he had said earlier.
But let's talk about why. I think the Barnes was failing financially. Those of us, both in Philadelphia and around the country, could see it failing. There have been histories written about how and why it failed. Whether people agree with all those histories, again, the people who are engaged in the debate about whether it should move or not will probably selectively read those histories. But it was very clear to those of us who were in the not-for-profit world that it was failing, and it wasn't a question of whether it would fail. It was really becoming a question of when it would fail, and nobody was happy about it. I mean, none of us were watching this with any sort of phlegmatic calm. There was a great deal of upset that this extraordinary institution was going to hit the rock, and the question was what would happen when it hit the rock. I think that's one of the things that really people who are against the move have not wanted to take on board, that it was going to hit the rock, and when it hit the rock, how on earth was it going to survive in anything like the form that it had survived for 80-odd years. And people talk about the three foundations who were the principles behind the move, the Pew Foundation, the Lenfest Foundation, the Annenberg Foundation, as raiders, as wanting, being representative of the Philadelphia elite who wanted to, as it were, get their own back on, Barnes's self-isolation, and finally bring him into the fold, which he'd so much hated. I think there's a completely wrong take on it, and And I say it, and I would have said this, you know, whether I'd come to the Barnes or not. I just think it's a wrong take because I was watching it happen. I just think that what's happened is far from raiding it, they've actually saved it, because it's only in this way that it's actually going to survive in a way that is not only in the spirit of Barnes, but recognizably like the Barnes as it's been for the last 80 years. And the fact that it's moving location is and I think Judge Ott was absolutely right in this, is the least thing that could have happened to it. I mean, you know, we could all speculate about the worst thing that could have happened to it, but I don't particularly want to think about the worst thing that could have happened to it. I think moving...
You feel the collection could have been scattered?
I'd like to think that all sorts of things would have happened, you know. If the solution that was found, which is to move to Philadelphia, hadn't been possible, I think people would have tried to do, you know, all sorts of things to avoid it being scattered. I think all of us would have hated for it to have been scattered. But the fact is, it's going to move to Philadelphia, and we're going to display it in the way that it's displayed in Merion.
How can that be? I had heard that. It will actually be displayed in that high modernist style we had discussed? So that's been decided.
Judge Ott has said that, you know, that's I want you to move it, and I want you to.
What kind of space? What kind of building do you have? I don't know.
I can't tell you yet. It's too early. We haven't even you know, really got underway with the architectural selection process, and until we've selected an architect, until we've talked to the architect. I mean, the process of selecting an architect is going to clarify various ways of thinking about the building. I mean, this is the 5th building I'll have done. It's not that I haven't done buildings before. So I can, you know, in my mind, I can think of different ways of doing it. I can think of the ways that different architects would do it. But the one thing I'm sure it won't look like from the outside, it won't look like the Paul Cray building. I would see no
reason to duplicate that.
No virtue in it.
Yeah.
I can see a reason because people have said, just replicate it. But I said, you can't see a virtue in it. You know, the Cray house, the Cray building is a lovely mansion, and it's a really beautiful building, and we're going to use it in Merion. I mean, we're still going to be using it.
But it's so particular to its site.
It's particular to its site, and exactly. And it's one of Cray's major works, and it would be a very, you know, it would be a very postmodern thing to do, to replicate it, but it's not. I don't think it's where we're coming from.
So what time frame are we talking about? When do you envision that this building will be done?
Well, the chairman has said 2009, so that's where we're
headed for 2009. Well, I hope I hope it will be by that date, although that's far in the future. It's still not as far as I had envisioned.
Right.
Anyway, I want to thank you very much for being here today and talking with us, and for being so forthright about what's going on.
It's a pleasure.
And thank you for joining us today at the Drexel interview.